Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pollock, Krasner House and Study Center's annual John H. Marburger III Memorial Lecture, co-sponsored by Guildhall and made possible by Stony Brook University's John H. Marburger III Memorial Fund. I'm Helen Harrison, the director of the Pollock, Krasner House and Study Center, and I want to thank Guildhall's executive director, Andrea Grover, and the John Rue Theater staff for hosting this event so graciously. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Ann Temkin, the Marie-Jose and Henry Kravis Chief Curator of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. Ann will give us a behind-the-scenes look at MoMA's new collection galleries, scheduled to open on October 21st. As she told the art newspaper back in March, what we want to do is recapture the initial sensibility of the museum, which was one of being challenging and provocative. In Good Old Modern, his irreverent history of MoMA, Russell Lines described the dinner celebrating its 5th anniversary in 1934. In his remarks to the gathering, Princeton professor Frank Jewett Mather advised the trustees and staff to be as daring and adventurous as the artists whose work they were collecting. The business of every modern museum, he told them, is to live as dangerously as possible. In the decades since that night, MoMA has done its share of dangerous living. Many storms have been weathered during its 90-year lifetime. Paradoxically, its most daunting problem has been the ever-growing popularity of modern art itself. The works that were so controversial when they were acquired have, with time, become beloved attractions. And people also flock to see the many loan exhibitions, performances, films, and other events. Over the years, being challenging and provocative has required more and more real estate. But to fill that mandate, the museum must grow conceptually as well as physically, must enlarge its vision as well as its footprint. That, according to MoMA's director, Glenn Lowry, is the point of the new edition. The real value of this expansion, he says, is not more space, but space that allows us to rethink the experience of art in the museum. Lately, Ann Temkin's rethinking cap has been getting a workout, and I can't imagine anyone better suited to the task. After receiving her BA from Harvard and her PhD from Yale, Ann began her distinguished career as an assistant curator in MoMA's Department of Painting and Sculpture. She went on to become the Muriel and Philip Berman Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where she was responsible for the renovation of the modern and contemporary galleries. She returned to MoMA as curator in 2003 and became chief curator of painting and sculpture in 2008. Throughout her tenure, Ann has focused on the department's acquisition program and on reimagining the collection galleries. Let's find out where her ideas will take us. And those who would like to continue the conversation are welcome to ask questions after she finishes, and also to come back to the Pollock Krasner House and join us for wine and cheese. But first, let's welcome Ann Temkin.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today for this hour of art history, kind of thinking out loud. I'm going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then I'd love to take questions for 10 minutes or so after that, because there may be things on your mind that I won't be addressing. But as Helen so nicely explained, yes, this is an expansion that isn't simply or even primarily about more space. And in this way, it's different from every expansion that MoMA has had since we were founded in 1929. We are on a kind of regular beat of expansions every 20, 25, in this case 15 years. And in all of those previous cases, essentially the idea was more room for that which we did. And the reason this one gives me and everybody so much to talk about is that it's very different from that. For the first time in our 90-year history, partly by chance, in fact, an expansion of the space is coinciding with a real overhaul of the curatorial thinking at the museum. And if you think about it, the curatorial approach over the last half of the 20th century at MoMA was very stable, almost uniquely stable in terms of very long tenured curators who determined what we were doing, a program of acquisitions that stuck to ideas that were developed at mid-century and kind of stayed consistent. None of that really changed for the opening in 2004, which obviously was planned, as early as the 1990s. So this opening is really our first, we feel, 21st century way of thinking about, and now that we're 20% into the 21st century, in fact, of thinking about what it is we're doing. And everybody who is involved with it, including myself, has been at the Modern just for a decade. Really, maybe a few of us, 12 or 13 years. But it's an entirely new cast of characters. There's not a single chief curator who's been there more than a decade. So what is going on with the thinking? The first thing I would say is it's all about the collection. This was very, very important to us, that over the last 20 to 30 years in museum work, special exhibitions, blockbusters in particular, so took over what it was that we put our time, our energy, our advertising, our budget, our manpower toward. You thought about going to the museum and you wondered, what is the show right now? And this became more and more exaggerated over the course of the last 2 or 3 decades. And it finally reached a breaking point for most of us, and frankly, colleagues at institutions throughout the world, who were thinking, wow, in our case, we are sitting on a collection of 200,000 objects, for which we pay tens of $millions a year, insofar as new acquisitions, and millions of dollars a year in storing and cataloging and all of that. And if you think about it with a kind of business head, it's like, what company or entity would have assets of that sort of dimension and essentially leave them in storage, 90% of them? Because, as is well known, what we have been showing in our galleries at any given time is in the single digits, maybe 5% of what that collection is. And instead of just feeling like, oh, that's a shame, which curators have for decades, I think at the beginning of the 21st century, for us, it actually became something of a moral issue and an ethical one, of feeling, instead of proud of these riches, feeling like suddenly we were hoarders. And that was not a good feeling. And the incredible force of the realization of the disconnect between the warehouse that we have in Queens and all of the storages we have on 53rd Street and even beyond, off in Connecticut, for example, and what it was that you were seeing and thinking MoMA was when you went to 53rd Street, that disconnect was no longer acceptable to us. So the very first ground rule we made, and this is almost a decade ago, was that the new expansion would be galleries for the collection, not galleries for more special exhibitions, but just for presentations of works we owned. And with that initial ground rule in place, then we had to start thinking, okay, how are we going to show that collection? And this has prompted, that question prompted very, very hard rethinking, I think, and soul searching on the part of ourselves, particularly at MoMA, because it's kind of poignant almost. MoMA is the place that, fairly or not, to an exaggerated degree or not, is associated with the very idea of the canon that has been absolutely debunked, you could say, over the last probably more like 20 or 30 years in academics, but building until now. And MoMA is associated, in fact, Alfred Barr, our founder, is associated with this way of presenting modern art, and this is true from the day we opened, as progressive. It's almost like they were modeling themselves on a scientific model, where indeed, in science, a new person, a new scientist comes along, and the next scientist comes along, and they're all improving on themselves, and it's a very causal relationship from past to present to future. This model is the one that MoMA adopted. You could also call it a biblical model of Abraham begetting Isaac, begetting Jacob, et cetera, and there was this sense of directionality in a straight line. And many of you may have heard these funny anecdotes about previous generations of curators who, when visitors came to MoMA, if they started at the wrong end, the curators would instruct the guards to turn the people around and make them go to the beginning, because God forbid they didn't start with Cézanne. This kind of sense of a train chugging along in terms of making history has been overturned in the last 20 years, not just in art history, but in American history, world history, political history, any kind of history. The idea that there is this tight story that can be told, as I'm sure you've all read in whatever your own fields are, has been replaced by one where there are many simultaneous histories. And there are absolutely no doctrine or dogma that can begin to tell the riches of the various perspectives, the various points of view of any one point in time, whether you're talking about literature or art or the world. This is what we all feel as curators at MoMA now. And so we were confronted here on our own site, this very same place, despite all of the expansions and new buildings, that in 1929, Alfred Barr started out with this idea of Cézanne to Picasso, et cetera, we are saying that doesn't feel like 2020 to us. And just as Helen was saying, Frank Mather was lecturing when MoMA was 5 years old, you have to be radical. We are feeling very much that what we want to go back to is that 1930s feeling of you need to be radical. And I think what happened over the last few decades of the 20th century is we started believing our own mythology of being the authority, the establishment, in fact, the canon. And there became a certain, I would say, lack of curiosity, lack of questioning that today feels very urgent to us. At that time, it wasn't a lack. It was correct for that time. But today, we look at the MoMA presentations over this last 50 years, and they don't reflect who we are. So, who are we? That's the question. The first thing we are is a museum with 6 departments divided by medium. This was the defining characteristic when we opened. When we opened, there was no such thing as a museum with a photography department because photos were not thought of as artworks. Photos weren't something you would buy, except buying yourself photographed for the sake of having a portrait in your home. Movies were not something that were considered museum worthy. Our first film curator, Iris Barry, in the mid-1930s, started collecting film from literally the trash bins of the Hollywood studios. When a movie was done, they threw it away. So this kind of sense of the film as art to be preserved, or as anything to be preserved, forget art, was brand new to MoMA and a few equivalent institutions for the first time in the 1920s and 30s. So when we began just using film and photography as examples, obviously, design objects, all of that, this was the first time that these were things that got called art, together with painting and sculpture. As the decades went on, those 6 departments essentially moved apart as each one grew more and more large, more and more important, more and more really trailblazing in its own field. And they became almost what you could call like 6 independent museums. In addition, as our space grew, almost inevitably, the distances between the presentations of those different mediums grew. So if in the 1960s, or even I recall in the 80s, the drawings department galleries were still across the corridor from the paintings galleries. The photo galleries were one floor down across the floor from the later painting and sculpture. So nothing was out of reach. With our expansion in 2004, the painting and sculpture department got the major 2 corridors of real estate on the 4th floor and the 5th floor, and you had to go elsewhere on the 2nd or 3rd floor to find galleries devoted to photography or architecture, etc. So essentially the message we were giving people was that the history of art of the 20th century was the history of painting and sculpture. And then there are those other auxiliary things. And for my generation, this is exactly the opposite of what Barr intended when he founded a museum with all of those disciplines within it. So the first thing we decided was that we were actually going to overturn that segregation and work together so that the main course of galleries became larger and overtook those galleries that had been on the other floors and that were medium specific. So when you come in October, there won't be a place for you to go to see architecture anymore in the same way that you remember. You will be going through the galleries, and in 3 or 4 galleries, you'll come to one that's devoted to architecture. Photos, there will be certain galleries devoted to photos, but also by the time you're in the 2nd gallery, there are going to be photos, etc., etc. And that may seem like not rocket science, and I think you have to know that for MoMA, the institutional kind of academic entrenchment and power of those individual departments is such that figuring out how we could link our collections together and actually do the work of it together was an incredible challenge that we basically spent a good 5 years thinking about together. And this is 10 years ago. The 6 chief curators decided to spend every Friday morning for 3 hours just talking this out. Because everything about the way the museum was structured was different for each department. Every department had its own registrar, every department had its own conservators, every department had its own budgets for installation, on and on and on. So there was absolutely nothing structurally, like in the car, to make it happen that you could install galleries with people working in the departments across boundaries. So we sort of had to take the car apart and put it back together with new wires and new everythings. I don't know anything about cars, so. And make it be that we could install a gallery that would have moving image in it, whether film or video, that would have work that's like light sensitive, like a watercolor or a photograph, a work like Starry Night that needs, however many feet around it we can possibly devote to it to accommodate the people who come just to take the picture in front of it. And all of that had to somehow be figured out how to make it work together. And we started talking about the task that we had given ourselves as a sex change operation. It felt that fundamental to the way MoMA was set up. Now that we're actually in the midst of it, we feel like sex change operation isn't even strong enough. There's not a department, so now you're into lungs and kidneys and everything, that has not been rewritten and restructured to accommodate a curator from drawings and a curator from architecture working together on a gallery and picking objects from 6 departments that will be in that gallery. And this mixed media thing I can now say, because we're about a third of the way done with the installation, is astonishing in the dramatic change of how it makes you see the works that you already No, it doesn't have to be one new work that's on view, but the way in which seeing these works that of course were created at the same time, and in many cases by the same people, together as they were at the time of making and at the time of showing and at the time of when those people were living. I feel like what we've done is removed the layer of museumology and brought ourselves much closer to the time and place in which these things were made. And if you think about it from the point of view of an artist, you know, it's not like this artist puts on her drawings hat to go do drawings and then has another studio to go to. I mean, if she's lucky, maybe she does have another studio to go make her sculptures, and then never the twain shall meet, and then on the days that she wants to go make a video, goes somewhere else to do it and shows those in a different gallery. No, it's one person. And I think a lot of our thinking on this is very much in sync with how artists are working today, that you rarely find a painter who isn't also making photographs or making videos, and on and on and on. So the kind of disruption of boundaries in even being able to call a certain thing that's made in 2020 a painting or a sculpture or a print or a photo. You know, the photographer paints all over her photo. Those differences are very much mirrored now in our approach of saying, you know what, those are fantastically helpful functional distinctions insofar as our acquisitions meetings, as far as our conservation labs. There's no reason to extend that to the way our galleries look. And the kind of proof of it for us in the 20 heads are better than one, let alone 2 heads are better than one, is that when we go through the galleries that we have done already, and we look at them, we each know, whether we're a painting and sculpture person or a photography person or architecture, there is no way we could have done these ourselves. And I'm not going to say that there wasn't a lot of question and even pain and anxiety on the parts of each of my colleagues and me. And we were thinking in terms of loss or sacrifice, right? Like, I had 40,000 square feet of galleries that I had authority over, and that was my job with whatever assistance I wanted to handle it with me. Same for everybody else. We each have given up that level of the very old, very associated with MoMA czar-dom, and said, you know what, 2020 is not a time for czars. 2020 is a time for collaboration, 2020 is a time for teams, and 2020 is actually a time for democratic curating. So the way we're designing these galleries is actually assistant curators, curatorial assistants, curators, senior curators, everyone mixed together. And there's an attitude, of course, we're putting less experienced people together with more experienced people, but as things go, the less experienced people are younger, and their ideas have been absolutely as present as the ones of the bosses. And again, I think we see the results and we say, you know, I have to admit, it's doing the right thing, it feels better, this is a better product. And we'll see what other people think in October. But the feeling about the process is that it is a healthy process from a humanity kind of point of view, and that feels great. In terms of what is the collection, there's also a very different point of view from the last 50 years. I think before, it's fair to say, there was a general approach and a general consensus, even if it was unstated, that what appeared in the galleries, as opposed to all of those stacks and stacks and screens of storage, were the best things. So of course, MoMA has prided itself always on the depth of its collection. You have 50 paintings by Picasso. Generally, there were 10 of those 50. There were 7 or 8 only that were out on view because those were in some way deemed the most important. Today, we have a very different attitude about the best, and I think that is because, again, we're interested in a multiplicity of perspectives, and your best isn't my best. And we are recognizing that. And we also are saying a best in 2020 is different, perhaps, than a best in 2010, let alone 1970. And this gets us really to the question of the idea of a canon. Because one of the principal things that we have come to grips with and are working through in a very kind of soul-searching way is that the institution for so many years, like the institution of art history itself, was something that was written by white men. It's that simple. And primarily what those people were interested in was the work of people who shared that demographic identity. And again, I'm not condemning it. It was part of the time. These were people in sync with the zeitgeist of their period. But at that same level today, if we're a contemporary museum, and that we are a museum that is open today, we can't see how we can continue in that way. So one of the things we had to ask ourselves is, if we don't want this to look like it used to, what can we do? We have to figure out wider ways, not of expanding the canon just by tacking on X many works of art by women or X many works of art by artists of color, but by actually questioning how those additions even undo the whole premise of the canon, the whole premise of the best. And where we've come to in this thinking is that it's our job to present these different histories and these different communities and these different moments and these different approaches, say, to modern art that retain the same, and this is where it's good that I'm a middle child, the same sense of excellence and of this very loaded word that has always been there with MoMA, quality, and present ourselves with the opportunity to show that art history was so much broader than the exhibition, than the collection displays at MoMA for so many decades would have suggested. And the really good news behind that realization is that MoMA's collection actually supports that kind of a broad presentation way more than what we've displayed in the past would ever lead you to suspect. So if you go and you think about it, 200,000 objects, well, that's, even Picasso didn't make 200,000 things. There is a lot there that, in fact, was bought by the trustees and the curators or donated by others over the course of 90 years that was way more quirky, and quirky is even not a good word, but way more off a very narrow definition of the greats of modern art than we would have ever thought. And all of these things have been almost lying dormant, works by women artists that were purchased during the 50s, during the 60s, made as gifts, not put on display more than very occasionally. Because with this sort of pyramid approach of the best is what, it's like if there were an underground mountain and just the tip of it made it above ground for people to be looking at. So when all you saw was that tip, you saw Pollock and you didn't see Krasner, for example. And the beauty of realizing that we had this whole underground part to work with has been nothing short of exhilarating over these few years. And people like me who are old enough to have actually been curators for 20 or 30 years and ourselves sort of go along with that other way of looking at things are going through a kind of profound inner evolution, because it's kind of like the veil has been lifted from before our eyes. Here are things that, because we used this old kind of measuring standard, we were happy to say it was great that we had them, but we didn't have to show them. We didn't have to do the equal kind of research on them. We didn't have to do the equal kind of conservation on them. You know, there's a funny kind of joke among conservators, all conservators, but at MoMA, you know the important works are the ones that have been conserved the most. Because those are the ones that, you know, we're wanting to have clean, we're wanting to have out, we want to have them looking their best. And then you find that there are these works that now we're getting out for display in October that are so filthy dirty that, like, it's literally changing what we thought was a, you know, medium gray background to a sky blue background. Dramatic differences, because these were artists who were not considered, it wasn't even a conscious decision, it didn't even reach the decision point. They weren't even sort of eligible for thought of, are these things that should be cleaned on a regular basis? So this kind of excavation, or almost archaeology, within what is a collection of things from all over the world, you know, we're often talked about as being so narrowly European and North American. In fact, there's lots, particularly from the 60s, when, just because of the certain curators who were there, we did shows of art from India, art from Japan, art from South America, all of them bringing with them acquisitions. And then we made the acquisitions, we're excited about the shows, and then they just lay dormant, basically. So we're now able to take advantage of that. And then the second thing that we're able to do is add to this a whole kind of, what can I even say? The word is just, for each of us, mind-boggling opportunity to add to the collection and to absolutely reshape the contours of the demographic spread, the geographic spread. And all of this is kind of, what would I say? It's heady, because we're realizing that these are things that all these years people had the opportunity to buy, and the reasons they were not being bought had nothing to do with that they were works that were inferior artistically. They were not being bought because, for example, like so many museums, MoMA was essentially a museum of white art history, with fantastic exceptions, many fabulous exceptions to that, by the way, which are described and analyzed and critiqued and explored in a book that we're publishing this month called, among others, Blackness at MoMA, which chronicles our first acquisitions, exhibitions, so many opportunities that we actually passed over, so many attempts that kind of got repressed, and this very bumpy road of how at MoMA art by Black artists was shown. But now we're in this amazing position where it's not too late, and we are finding works by these artists. I think of the overlooked obituaries now that is in the New York Times. It's the same thing at our places and so many museums, where we're able to go back and find works from 1960, from 1945, whatever it may be, that to our eyes today at least are so rich and so impossible to describe as second class compared to that with which we're more commonly associated, and that are basically still affordable. And so we're buying works at a pretty handsome clip of artists who, for example, are going to be on show on the 5th floor, on the 4th floor, because we're staying, by the way, I didn't mention, chronologically based, that when you go through from the first gallery to the last, it'll essentially be 1880 to 2020. But you'll see these works, and these will be works that, and now I'll talk money for a moment because it's just a kind of clever shorthand, that we bought today for, let's say, $5 million. They'll be side by side with something, A, that you couldn't buy today, but that when we lend it, the insurance value is 10 or 100 times that. And there is an absolute resonance. There's an, I don't even want to say parody, but there's a dialogue and there's a richness that comes through much, much more than anybody could have predicted. And I think one of the things we're feeling about it is that when you see these galleries hung with things by artists who were all working in a given space at a given time without having been sort of culled by academia, you're brought back to that moment of creation in such a vivid way because this person was working next to that person. And in fact, this person whose work maybe not be considered so major because they never really developed to have a strong career for 40 years, but that one period of 3 years, they were making incredible stuff, and we're buying that thing from that 3 years. That is the kind of thing that makes us feel like we're bringing the museum back to the point where in the 1930s, and this is what you have to remember, modern art was contemporary art. So there wasn't modern art and contemporary art. That was one thing. And over these few decades, those two things have obviously drifted into two different sort of ends of a spectrum. And we're trying, like if that were a rubber band that's been pulled, we're just snapping it and bringing it back to one thing. So that hopefully, I would say, if someone is in the galleries and feels like, oh, this is a lot of art that I don't know already, and yet here's a Jackson Pollock, and here's a Mark Rothko, you're not going to feel like it was some kind of token gesture or some kind of, this is a great word, virtue signaling, to see an artwork by somebody from India or an artwork by somebody who's female next to those major headliners. It actually, the dialogue that they had was there. And we are just surfacing something that was actually buried for all of this time. So I think what I'm saying is we don't feel like we're exerting a point of view. We're not imposing something. And I think if anything, what we're saying is we want to get away from a museum curator's or an academic's imposition on the histories of art. We just want to present them. And this recalls, I'm sure you all know this, what is it? I can't think of the word, story about, or this famous saying from Barnett Newman, supposedly, where he said that aesthetics is to artists as ornithology is to the birds. In other words, the birds couldn't care less about an ornithologist, and artists could not care less about the divisions that we make among the kind of work that they produce in the world. So for that reason, when we open in October, you will not have galleries. Every gallery will have a placard at the start to tell you what this gallery is about. None of those placards, or very few of them, will say Fauvism or German Expressionism. Because what we began to realize, and Helen alluded to this, is now, very differently from 50 years ago, a great number of people who come to MoMA know nothing of art history. I mean, literally zero. They don't even know Starry Night. And yet, because of the change in so many things about entertainment and tourism and so forth, they come to MoMA. Those people didn't come to MoMA 50 years ago. So apart from just the increase in numbers, it's a different audience who is coming to us. And I found myself, over the course of the last decade, giving tours to certain general groups, and I listened to the words coming out of my mouth, and then Fauvism turned into Cubism, and I realized this had no more meaning for these people than if I were speaking Chinese, you know? And what difference does it make to them? I'm an art historian, they're not art historians. They don't care what movement led to which movement. And that was a real breaking point for us to just decide we could do without that. And so, for example, a gallery about Dada, which requires saying, what was Dada, when was Dada born, da-da-da, is called something like, I don't remember exactly, Around the Ready-Made. And then we tell you the concept of the ready-made, and here's a bicycle wheel on a kitchen stool, and this is what changes the whole thought that art is supposed to be associated with hand making and craft and skill. etc., and instead be centered in ideas. And, it's a 5-sentence placard. But our goal is that every gallery has that kind of approachability and accessibility, because we're saying, you're here, we want to welcome you, we want to make you feel included as a visitor, just like we're wanting to make these artists who were not included before feel included on our walls. So everything that I'm talking about is very connected, and none of it kind of can be pulled out without another piece, whether I'm talking about the working together of the staff, or the approach to the visitors, or the way we're seeing the telling of the history of art. So on another strain of that, I think one of the biggest changes for the galleries as we're going forward, and this is very, very hard to explain in advance. The way we're gonna work, what you see when you come in October, or whenever you come, November, December, January, will be up on view for either 6 months or 12 months or 18 months. But every 6 months, 1/3 of the museum is going to be changed. Ongoing basis for the next, decade. That is the only thing that we could figure out to do that would allow us to even make a dent in those 200,000 objects. And you know what? I'll be generous. Let's say 100,000 of those objects aren't worth showing. So let's say 100,000. Let's even cut it down to 50,000. Because a lot of them you could say are study objects, are duplicates, whatever. But let's even cut our 204 and say we have 50,000 usable objects deserving of showing on some kind of basis. How do you begin with an expansion of 40,000 square feet? How do you begin? What if we had taken the whole 80 floors of the Nouvelle Tower in which our new expanded galleries are housed? We would not even touch it. The only answer that we could come up with was to combine the spatial expansion of additional galleries with a temporal expansion that would be derived by rotating the collection galleries. And as you know, up until now, it was almost like a dichotomy that the temporary shows changed 3 times a year. There was a party, there was an opening, they came down, a new one came up. So it was really a kind of performative pace. And the collection galleries were assumed to be dormant. Now that in fact wasn't the case, because of course for all of the light sensitive work, they had to be switched out twice a year. I, in the painting and sculpture galleries, switched things out, individual galleries, on a kind of frequent basis because we were trying out all of this thinking. But in principle, and certainly during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, you came to the collection, and probably many of you used the phrase permanent collection, which is kind of a weird, because like, what's the temporary collection? The things you're gonna sell, the things you're gonna lose, things you're gonna destroy? I don't think so. So permanent collection, there is no more permanent collection, it's a collection. But the collection is this kind of messy, woofy thing that you can't wrap and tie a nice ribbon around in a box. And for that reason, the only way we're going to proceed successfully is that we install all this with galleries that are more beautiful than we could have hoped to make them, and then say whether it's in this part of the museum or that part of the museum in 6 months, 12 months, okay, it's coming down. And we are going to, as a body, reinstall those works in a different configuration with different additions, some subtractions, certain things that won't go away ever because we would have a mutiny. And we also believe in the greatness of having Demoiselle d'Avignon on view all the time. But reconfiguring those things, and then as good as those galleries may be or how interesting to us, it's like kill your darlings, they're done, and new ones will come in. So this has led to an incredible overhaul, of course, in manpower. because the manpower that we have allotted has always been with special exhibitions. And then there have been a few people who were like the collection handlers. Now, everybody is working on the installation of those collection galleries. And it has raised interesting issues, all kinds of unexpected questions. Here's this one. If you do a show, a temporary show, like whatever, it's curated by Temkin. If you do all these collection galleries, it's unacknowledged, unsigned, seemingly, non-authored. Those collection galleries are now going to be made by everybody, and we have to think hard about how do we give the satisfaction of public recognition for that gallery work and not make it seem like it's less valuable and therefore anonymous vis-a-vis special exhibition work. All sorts of questions like that have come up, but it is amazing. So I think I can, wrap up by saying that the galleries that we're working on now, we're literally installing for October, but at the same time, we are already hard at work on the checklists for next April. So it is a kind of dizzying experience to realize that what we're doing and what we've been building up so far, so long for, will in fact come down, and by 2 years from now, everything in the entire building will have been redone since this coming October. But it is the way that we feel. Not only does it allow us the time to make the public see our collection, allow the public to see our collection, but along with that, it conveys the message that we do not believe that modern art history or history is fixed, right? That it's not something that is stable or static, but it's something that very much responds and changes and kind of expands and contracts and stretches and turns itself around depending on the time of the telling. And we want to make sure that the time of the telling is now, and that this sense of todayness is there for all of the art that we're presenting. So I think I'll end with that and open it up to questions, because I'm sure there's a lot that I haven't touched on and that you may be wondering about.
Is this on? Okay. Two quick questions. One, you mentioned kind of versus 50 years ago that more people come to the museum, but perhaps fewer people know the differences between different movements in art history. I'm curious whether that's a trend that you would want to embrace or whether you would prefer to sort of combat it. And then secondarily, MoMA has an amazing American modernist collection that's often not on view. Is that an area that with the new expanded galleries, will be sort of more of an effort to show some of those works and sort of highlight what a great collection you guys have of those works?
So I'll answer in reverse order. Yeah, the American collection would be one example of things that have generally been less shown, in large part because I think people felt, you can go to the Whitney and also see Arthur Dove and Marston Hartley and so forth. But that is one of innumerable categories that, yes, and I'm not saying that we'll have an American art room all the time, but there will be works by those artists shown here and there in different ways that wouldn't have been if they were only categorized in that kind of American art history chapter way. Insofar as, do I wish that, if I understood you right, that the broad public weren't so broad, if that's kind of what you said? And I think, there's a lot of talk about how people who come to museums now, whether you're talking about the Louvre or Tate Modern or MoMA, are just like these zombies going through the galleries and they're not even paying attention or whatever. If you hang out in our galleries, you see that's actually not true. These are people who are, not every single one, But it's always amazing to me to go into the galleries and to see that these people who, you know, I have no idea what they've read in art history or whatever, but it is engaged audiences. And so they're not like tromping through supporting some bias we might have that, you know, if you don't read the New Yorker, you're not going to know enough or something to be in our galleries. That has been really clear, that you don't need art history, or you don't even need a humanities education to get a direct whatever response to looking at a work of art. And the art history aspect of it is a fairly relatively narrow percentage of the importance or the effect of that work as a thing. Does that make sense? Yeah.
This is obviously a very radical approach in relation to your history. So as an economic institution, who's concerned about attendance and ultimately attracting these blockbuster shows that brought people into the museum, and that resonated financially, to what extent do the people who perhaps were on your board, to what extent, how did they react to all of this? To what extent did they consider this a risk? And how restrictions did you experience when you brought the idea up?
So it's not kind of one day we brought the idea up. You know, the nice thing about this is it has been a viewpoint that has...
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry, sure.
Thank you.
Was there objection on the part of trustees or questions on the part of the people responsible for the finances of the museum that kind of turning away from the blockbuster emphasis and going more toward the kind of, you could say, maybe less sensational collection-based approach, was this troubling to them? And I'm happy to say it was a long series of discussions and kind of profound discussions, you know? It wasn't just on a pragmatic kind of level. And they're with us. They're with us. And I think we are so lucky, of course, to be MoMA. You know, all of my peers all over the world have this same attitude right now. MoMA is by no means in isolation. And it's just that we have this collection that makes all of this kind of thinking, like, you know, perfect because of what it is that we have to work with. So I think people aren't worried. I mean, like, Starry Night's going to be the draw. Do you know what I mean? Monet's Water Lilies are going to be the draw. If anything, as Helen was alluding to, you know, for the curator's point of view, it's like, oh, maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if there weren't quite as many people. But I think the idea is that, yeah, there will be many people and there will be more, and they will be attracted to this idea of, you know, that in a sense, if you come to MoMA on a given day, what you're going to be seeing is like 75 mini exhibitions in each of those galleries. It's definitely a change of thinking, and it won't be, we didn't come to it overnight, and nor will it be overnight that the public catches on to it, I don't think.
With the historical, the traditional way of working that you mentioned, the curatorial lines, especially vis-a-vis real estate, are quite clear. How do you prepare a staff of curators for then suddenly this interaction? Do you give them small projects, or their lead curators in some cases? I mean, the Met has dealt with that some with Breuer.
So like to prevent pure chaos? So we're trying to work out different systems and different structures, and it's a work in progress for sure. But the way we have it now is chief curators each have teams of curators and assistant curators and curatorial assistants divided up chronologically through like early, middle, and late part of the collection. And then what we do is actually meet at this point on a couple of times or 3 times a weekly basis to compare what we're all doing, to make sure that it is kind of in sync with each other. So our motto is actually more work for more people. That is what's going on, because the amount of the need to have each other's expertise is great. And we're not wanting to toss out the baby with the bathwater. You know, we're not wanting to junk the fact that somebody in the print department really knows the difference between an etching and an aquatin and a dry point, etc., and just kind of level the playing field. We're going for kind of the best of both worlds, of having these curators with these very arcane realms of expertise working together in a generalized way. We'll see. Did that answer the question?
We up here.
Back in February of 1989, the MoMA closed out our Jackson Pollock. And I'm just wondering if you could share some impeccable words of how we might be presented at the MoMA this year.
Oh, well. How will Jackson Pollock be presented this year? Now, maybe this is something actually which presents a kind of counterpoint to what I've been saying for the this hour. You might not find it to be all that different. I mean, the paintings are the paintings. They're glorious. They're in rooms of other paintings and sculptures and works on paper made by artists in the 40s and 50s and 60s. One thing that is a little different is our chronology is looser. So I think we would be showing, for example, a 1977 de Kooning with a 1950s something else, you know, because we're just kind of getting looser all together. But insofar as the Pollocks go, they're up. They look stunning.
We have the real thing here.
Exactly. So, yeah, that may not strike you actually as that different, but maybe it will. I can't predict.
Thank you.
Say one more question if there is one. Back
here.
up there.
Hello. I'm thinking about your annex, PS1, and to what degree does PS1 factor into what MoMA 53rd Street will be involved in doing, in integrating more of the various mediums, photography, filmmaking, performance art. To what degree would the very, very contemporary activities at PS1 factor into the grand scheme at MoMA?
I think that our affiliation with MoMA PS1, which is now almost 20 years old, actually has had an effect on all of this, right? Because when I was making, for example, the analogy with this is the way artists work today without boundaries among mediums, that's something that was never even remotely in the minds of any of the people at MoMA PS1 or any of their presentations. So there is an impact from them on us, and I think there's an impact on us on them in terms of certainly showing also more of our collection in shows there, acquiring things for our collection from new artists on view there. It has been a productive partnership that has played a role in this, and people from PS1 have been involved in all of this talking for a decade that I'm describing to you. Absolutely, I'm glad you brought that up.
Thank you.
Yes?
So to the extent that you're now looking at your 200,000 objects,
Yeah.
which maybe you weren't, your 200,000 objects, to what extent are you thinking about them other than potentially in some way incorporating them much more? Are you looking them in a dynamic way? Are you thinking about maybe selling some things where you have, in other words, how fresh is the look over the entire collection at this point in relation to particularly the way an institution functions today and its needs as you're buying new things?
Yes, insofar as all that goes, we're also putting new things on view. We're also saying, here are some things that absolutely will never stand a chance. We're selling them. Here are things that need to be shown, aren't going to be shown all the time at MoMA. We're going to circulate them in exhibitions around the country, bring that back, which was a big part of our past that kind of went down in the last 20 years, 30 years. So yeah, you're right. Also, thank you for bringing that up. It's not all about 53rd Street. It's about sending things out into the world, whether by sale or by lending certain long-term loans to other places that make sense, so that activating the collection has many more forms than just our own galleries. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. I think I'll echo Helen's invitation to wine, and she's at the Pollock Krasner house. Thank you.